I am Emily Holland, and this is my new book called Chained by Unforgiveness. It's a lot of what the title includes. It's about forgiveness, but it's also characters walking through that, even finding romance between things and action with other stuff. Well, I try to think back. This book has been in progress for 3 years, maybe even 4. I started it when I was homeschooling, and I remember I simply just needed something to do for homeschooling, so I just started writing. And I have a lot of stories, and the weird thing is I can remember where most of the stories come from. But with this book, I can't. All I know is one day I started writing. I know it had roots in daydream, and a lot of my stories come from daydreams I originally have, but I just started writing, things were added, and added characters came alive in their own way, especially with God and working that all out, yeah. The biggest challenge for me personally was grammaring. But overcoming it, I had a really, really, really helpful mom who was always there. She had walked and grammared that book 3, 4, 5 times with me. We had an editor and God made it that way, but it was my mom who got me through the grammaring. And to be honest, that was the hardest thing. Well, a big message to take away from it is forgiveness. Because the characters walk through each of their own journey of having to forgive someone who really hurt them. That's the biggest message. But there's also messages about hope after bad things happen. The character development is interesting because you walk with the character, you get a lot of their backstory and how they grew up. I think for me, developing it was figuring out their backstory and why they were acting the way they were is how they got developed. And to be honest, when I develop characters, I know a lot of people who plan out their character and develop them. For me, as I write the story, the character develops into their own person. And then the backstory and all that, but they just develop on their own. And favorite character, I would have to say, would have to be Elijah, which is the second main character to Amber, who is also, they're both very equally, but he's just strong and he never lets go and he never stops fighting for Amber. He also has my initials, which was something I wasn't planning. And another favorite character that isn't a main character, she doesn't have a big spotlight, but is Daisy, who is Paul's wife. She is just strong. She doesn't get much of a part, but I do really love her. There definitely was. Obviously, I had the whole thing with this person having to forgive this other person. But the main one was I remember writing it, and all of a sudden I'm like, Lazipo, and this whole other side of the story came because one of the main characters is a cop in training. So there's this whole thing with the drug cartel, and that wasn't something planned at the beginning of the book. It just developed, and points started coming together, and it was like one day I was like, I know what I'm gonna do, and it led to really good parts in the book. I do have a favorite author right now, which is Frank Peretti, which has inspired the book I'm writing now. A lot of the speakers I've listened to and pastors, when I started getting closer to the book, a lot of people were talking about how dangerous unforgiveness was and offense was. So I definitely got a lot of the teachings well before I ever started learning about the dangers of unforgiveness. So I would say a lot of pastors, and I'm going to say her name, like Patricia King and even Ben and Jody, all these people, I heard these messages about forgiveness. So it was definitely something that was put into me well before I even started writing the book. So it gave great teaching when I went to write it. Well, first of all, that you have to do it. You have to start. And then learning how to write with God was something like the leading of the Holy Spirit. Not even hearing his voice, but it was the leading of the Holy Spirit that would take me and guide me into each thing. And he just filled me with the idea, and I would write it, and he guided me with every part of it. I think one of the most exciting parts was, one thing was the cover. Finishing the cover and seeing it as a book was so exciting because it relates to dreams in the book, and I was just like, this is amazing. And another thing that was just like, wow, it hasn't happened yet, but when people read it and tell me, wow, this spoke to me or came alive, that when people say that, that'll feel amazing. It is a completely new project. The day after we sent this book, right here, Chained by Unforgiveness, to an editor, I had a dream that led me to this. And the dream, I don't really recall the dream, but it led me with the idea of like, what would it be like to return to a life after 7 years and the life you once had was no longer, kind of like Castaway, but not like Castaway. And it led me to this whole story. The books, this one will be a trilogy. So I'm working on the first book. It'll be the Hidden series. The first book is called Hide, and it's about a missionary who he is in Colombia, and a war breaks out between Colombia, Venezuela, Central America, Mexico, and he decides to stay. And throughout the book, you know, he goes through some challenges, but what really takes the book off is he gets accused of killing somebody who is high in the cartel there, and he's pretty much chased the rest of the book. And the book, yeah, it's a really good series, and I'm over halfway done already with writing that. So ever since we started writing the book, we started meeting people all the time with the name. I cannot count how many people with the name Paul we met during writing this book, and we start not even just meeting the people are like the book, like the person in the book with the name. Ruth, like, is somebody in the book, and I knew a Ruth, and she was just exactly the same as in the book, and I not even like meaning to do that. But what was crazy is when we were editing, events started lining up with the book. Like, I had to do a rewrite, I had to add some events to a part of the book, and this person had a backstory. My mom comes home, and she tells me, I just had this encounter with this guy, and this is his backstory. I'm like, this is exactly the same backstory I just added to this guy on the same day. Like, same day happened. Just a lot of events were like, wow, this is very similar. And it's how God has always spoken to me, is that way. And even with this new book writing, when I add this, it wasn't just the storyline adding up, the characters, because even the day I named the character for this new book I'm working on, Mom met somebody with that name and had this encounter. Teachings, the characters would have to go through something, learn something. They were literally something I was going through in my own life that were something I needed to be telling myself. So it was just like wanting people to, I'm hoping that people encounter that as they read the book, that they start meeting people with the names, start things line up. You know, they really do get touched and find the healing, find the hope they need through a book, even though it's a good storybook and anybody can read it, but it's for everybody.